All right, how's everybody doing today? Are we feeling good? Any feedback?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All right, welcome Zoomers in the classroom, Zoomers in the chat. Our meeting is officially in session, and thankfully we can switch gears because it is officially the Halloween season. This is our last meeting before the holiday. So we have some flexibility this go around, thank God. But in the context of everything else we've been talking about, we've been going over sexual revolution, some political destruction, San Francisco type stuff. A lot of this can be chalked up as like political, but one of the themes we'd like to stay consistent here in this club is we want to talk about how categorization really limits people. And we're going to be getting into some specific people in a second here, but the idea that there's only one way to look at politics. There's only the 20th century lens. There's only this boomer con, maybe, and beforehand too, just the idea that older people, professor types, journalists are really the only ones that are the arbiters to explain this stuff. But I think we can give some of those tools to the Zoomers if we can. So like I said, sexual liberation, beautiful losers. This is kind of like modern horror in a way. You know, we're going to get into some characters here, but I think it's relevant for this presentation that when we look at all the political stuff, people used to say clown world a lot on Twitter. It's a bit stale now, but we really are in like this dark arc in this cinematic universe. And so I'd like to keep the horror theme kind of prevalent as we go in and out of political topics. But as you can see in the, Just Jimmy's in chat, we're back. So for this presentation, we'll be summarizing certain aspects of H.P. Lovecraft's life. And so that's the backdrop for, we'll be going back to the early 20th century during his lifetime and then cross-referencing that with some modern tidbits. So that's what we'll be going over. I also want to give, into our next slide here, I want to give credit, and I'm sorry, this is going to be a bit, it's going to be a bit difficult, but I'm going to be citing some French writers. So I'm going to give it a try. I think it's Deleuze and Guattari. Thank you. We got an educated Zoomer helping me out here. So I'm just going to say D and G. So shout out to Gio Benedetti for being the Italian Hungian futurist for helping me with the French vernacular. So those are some French psychoanalyst types. And a lot of people are aware of, that kind of is another form of modern horror, this kind of psychoanalyst Freudian school of thought, very problematic. It's not a defense of everything that they say, everything they believe, but it might help us set the stage here and make sense of some political topics. So the psychoanalyst stuff, not really consistent with our values, but we'll be using these, some of the writing of these Frenchies to help us out here. So D and G, they talk about how the modern world keeps itself stuck in a feedback loop, like a machine that controls its population while destroying culture along the way. And so a lot of sci-fi dystopia images tend to come to mind. And we'll be showing that in all its glory. The Ryan Gosling slides are coming up, so brace yourselves. We got everything all queued up.
Let's go.
That's right. And this modern culture, the D&G, these guys are honestly coming from like a leftist framework, some of it very Marxist friendly, but they are talking about consumerism, some extreme technology-based obsessions, and really the expansion of technology itself. So, and this has obviously accelerated a lot more since then, since they've written about this stuff. And also, I think it's also important to preface, this is not a defense of accelerationism. I think some people kind of get wrapped up in that world. It's very schizophrenic, and speaking more on that in a minute. But I just really want to stick to D&G. I want to stick to these French guys because a lot of people extrapolate other stuff on top of that. So I just want to keep that clear. So one of the consequences of the things that they emphasize is modern capitalism. And then to give a quote here we got from the Acceleration Manifesto, while crisis in this paralysis of the political imaginary, the future has been canceled, unquote. And so in other words, like we talk about in this club, identity, archetypes, local culture is replaced when it is not defended. You metaphorically can cancer future generations. Would-be geniuses can get intercepted because they assimilate into modernity, assimilate into technology-based culture, and often without consent. And so nothing new is coming out of society. I think, well, actually, we'll get to that later. There's a lot of the examples we often use is music. So when a genre gets comes out of a local scene, and then it becomes commodified, and then it becomes a product like anything else. And so we want to be self-aware of that as Zoomers. We're going to be seeing a lot of that in the foreseeable future. And then finally, the term that this is called by D&G, their academic term, is deterritorialization. And so I want that to be in people's minds. That is the grocery list of the academic stuff. Now we can start. About 5 minutes into the speech, we can start the speech. So that's all the house cleaning stuff. In our next slide, we can stay on topic here. Oh, sorry, that's the definition. Forgot that was there. So we can go on to Howard. So this is not a biography of H.P. Lovecraft, and I want to call him Howard to get a little bit more intimate. We don't have to refer to him as the master of horror, the titan of terror. I just want us to be familiar with the guy himself. We don't have to read Call of Cthulhu or anything else. It's just kind of someone to live vicariously through, to understand some of the timeless struggles that people encounter, especially Zoomers, younger people. So we'll be going back and forth between Howard's early 20th century perspective, the Roaring 20s, and these Frenchies later on, sort of their interpretation of politics at that time, and then it also coincides with today. So I'll try to mimic this dialectic. Hopefully things go well between Howard and D&G. There might be some overlap there. And then finally, I think probably the best way to kind of interpret this presentation is having a sci-fi writer's approach is often more logical than political commentary. You can imagine some of the commentators on social media, on YouTube, that a lot of young people kind of have this parasocial relationship with, kind of borrow their takes from, take their talking points, and then they say, these are my thoughts. But anyways, they'll, I feel like that way of doing things, this kind of like, this commentator thing where they think that they're journalists, they're like beat reporters because they found out what 4chan was and acceleration theory was in the last week. I think a lot of that is stale, and it's going to take some of this outside of the box thinking. And so that's why we're talking about French writers, we're talking about H.P. Lovecraft. That's the goal there. And so we might have to step into the entertainment industry. And because we are in the post-Trump era, you know, this is not our grandparents' politics. This is not Walter Mondale versus Reagan. We are in 21st century politics. And so we want to not emphasize so much as our older people have class warfare, party lines. I feel like those are relics of the 20th century. And with technology, it's going to be a bit of a distraction to get an understanding of it. And so we're going to be looking at one of the concepts that D&G talks about, which are schizophrenia, the idea that schizophrenia doesn't abide by boundaries. It can go in and out of different identities, and it's not loyal to a conventional structure the way that a lot of like American conservative boomercon types, they'll just stick to referencing the Trump era in relation to Nixon or Reagan, you know, things like that. It's just very one-dimensional, and so we want to look at history in all its glory, or lack thereof. So I think our next slide will be a little helpful here. All right. So I think a relevant starting point would be when Howard took his trip to New York, unfortunately. Now, this might sound familiar to some of us, something that seems to be a driving force in his early life when he tried to get involved in the, quote, amateur journalism movement, unquote. This eventually gets him closer to a local culture that we emphasize in the club. Back in Rhode Island, he had surrounded himself with some intellectual types, some writer types, common ground. And then more on that in a minute, because local culture keeps you sane, even if the world is crumbling around you. If you got a tight-knit, community-esque group of people, I think that you can basically stay sane under any circumstances. And Howard, unfortunately, didn't seem to follow that advice. And so we're going to be seeing his downfall, so to speak. But the reason why that's, you know, why do we have Susie Sue on the screen? We like to talk about how in music, a lot of local culture gets commodified. And so people think that if you're a punk rocker and you have the look, why do people in New York dress like California? They got the clothes, they talk like it. It's like this Western values kind of has a imperium over the world. Well, it's because the local culture has been commodified and taken across the entire world. And so I technically would not qualify that as true California values, because it has to exist within a local context. And so a lot of that stuff also happens in music. It happens with Rodney Bingenheimer's venue. It happens with like CBGB's, the idea that it kind of changes different eras. And so just to understand, when we're talking about capitalism, not to totally go against it, but with just this modern manifestation, I think is at the root of a lot of people's problems. And so A lot of that happens in the city, like New York. So in our next slide, to continue vicariously living through Howard, I'd like us to try to imagine it from his perspective. Again, this is early 20th century, so a lot of his views are a bit controversial. Some of them are a little politically incorrect, because our perception of the Roaring '20s is kind of this F. Scott Fitzgerald, this Great Gatsby, like these were the good times. We can also think about like the Weimar Republic, and we can think about just some of the counterculture that was prevalent during different parts of the world. The flappers. Now imagine you're Howard walking down Clinton Street in New York. Some of the people that he did not care for. Well, what were his main concerns, or what could we speculate they were? His experience in Rhode Island was very local, probably tight-knit, and the city is very cosmopolitan. It's often rootless. And also during this time, I mean, World War I had ended, but instead you had this like culture war. You had this decadent culture, organized crime. You had Al Capone, who I think inherited the leader of his organization around like 1925. Around Howard was still there, and so you had this crime wave. The early 1920s are really kind of like the 90s, how they kind of ended very drastically with the Wall Street crash of '29. And then, I mean, a bit of a stretch, but you got like Woodstock '99 at the end of the 90s. It kind of had this big explosive end of the decade, but people often romanticize it and say that this was the progressive era, like we know in 20th century progressivism. And so some overlap there. Also, the crime wave in the 1920s is just like the crime wave in the early 90s. People infamously talk about, Biden and Rudy Giuliani. I mean, you got a lot of similar overlap with these two completely different decades, seemingly. So this would be a better way to contextualize some of the early phase of modern capitalism. Obviously, technology had not taken root yet. I mean, you can just speculate what Howard would have thought in this like Heideggerian sense if he had seen where technology was going in AI. But we'll get to that in a sec here. And then I think in the next slide. All right, excellent. So Howard was very polarized by certain people. Again, this is also, there's an immigration wave happening in New York. This is very, there's a culture shock because he's from Rhode Island and he's seeing the city life. And so this is very, very strange. Now, we kind of take it for granted because by today's comparisons, I mean, these are probably what we would classify as like probably default people, kind of the standard views that you would come to expect. Now people are parading in the streets, galvanized by liberation ideology. So to get back into the academics of it, the identity, the archetype of somebody like Howard is, people like that today are often discouraged. There's a containment process to prevent them from having the views that he did. They're too controversial, don't fit in the conventional category, stops them from escalating. Meanwhile, the people that he spoke out against, the people that he was agitated with, seemingly, these people are accelerated. The people that he was critiquing back then are worse by comparison. The progression of the flappers and, as we said earlier, the Weimar cabaret types are allowed to branch out into more aggressive identities, activists, more political partisan types. And Howard's experience could be seen as, like I said earlier, the prologue, because by comparison, his New York experience was actually kind of closer to the ideal. We kind of like a lot of those older, early 20th century memories. He already saw it as a foregone conclusion. This thing is spoiled. All the best stuff is gone. Kind of like what Hegel said about art. He said that the Greek style and the Renaissance style was kind of a bygone era. And obviously he didn't live to see how much worse it accelerated. But it's important to have those culture critics that are already critiquing stuff during seemingly the heyday. To us, they would be the heyday. But to them, it was decline. I mean, well, that's a tangent. But anyways, I think you guys get it. So in this, the next slide. So so I told you we're gonna have gosling. It's Halloween season. So for Howard, we see what happens to certain people who get discouraged. It's very black-pilling. They're very pessimistic. They think because the world is crumbling around them that there's no hope, and that they can fill their heads with fantasies and they can find a reason to be happy, but according to them, it's all a foregone conclusion. They're just trying to cope. I don't think that should be the takeaway. I don't think that's a reasonable thing to live your life through, even if things are actually as bad as they assume it is. There's a video that was talking about Howard, and again, he was doing that thing that you're not supposed to do, where he was trying to reconcile these pre-modern views and modern views. He said, Howard, according to the climate at that time, he had those views. It would have been nice if he had just didn't have those views, as if you can do that. That kind of perverts the whole nature of people, the idea that we're going to fit them in this 21st century category where we filter out all the things that are from the 20th. You can't do it that way. You can't pick apart. You can't play operation with people's beliefs like that. So he was trying to say, he was also emphasizing, during the early 20s, you got D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. You got 20th century immigration to America. This is all very shocking to a lot of people who are sympathetic to Howard and his views, the more controversial ones. And then he said something that I think he didn't realize what he meant or what this implied, but he said the difference, because again, citing D.W. Griffith, the difference between Howard and the KKK is that they committed violence, and Howard was somebody who felt a bond with his own people, and he wanted to protect them. And if that distinction is made, the fact that violence is really that is the thing that separates American radicalism with American extremism, I think that is definitely an upgrade in political discourse compared to today. Those are acceptable terms moving forward. And to shout out to Josh Neal, a bit of a preamble for next week's speech. Josh Neal has a book called American Extremism, or American Extremists. And in that book, he talks about the distinction between an American radical and an extremist is somebody who goes out and does terrorism, ruins his life, that kind of like caricature of like a villain in America today. An American radical is somebody who opposes the government, is someone who doesn't toe a party line. By that definition, if that distinction is made, most people would qualify as American radicals. And so it's not about demonizing people. It's not about bullying these people into obscurity, banning them off social media. It's about being honest with the fact that there's going to be a lot of people moving forward that are going to be radical. And instead of having them indulge in this doom and gloom, extremist, dark arc, it would be a lot more beneficial to kind of categorize American radicalism in a much more detoxing way, since we're going to have a safety net available for people like that who are sympathetic to Howard's pre-modern views. Now, that's all some relatable stuff we could say about Howard's views. In the actually, we can stay here. And again, that's what they want you to end up like, and we don't want that. All of us want to be Ryan Gosling, but we do not want to be in this incapacitated state. The ending of Drive, we don't want that ending. We just want everything before that, okay? We want things to work out, and they will. So rest assured. Now, unfortunately, we also have to take note of some of Howard's shortcomings. He was, dare I say, he was an atheist, unfortunately, and he was a materialist. Now, in the next slide, this goes along with something we mentioned in our first slide of the series, bio-Leninism. We don't have to get into the specifics, but to bring the Frenchies back into this slide, the degenerated conditions of Western cities. Something that could have helped Howard with his materialistic worldview was to have some type of Christian ethics, because he is an atheist. And if you're a materialist, it's very strange because he was interested in the cosmos. It would have been very easy for him to just adopt metaphysics into his worldview. But I think because of the conditions, he saw the city life. He walked down Clinton Street, and it would also make me very ambivalent. But the fact that the only world that he really saw, it seems, was the modern world. And if he doesn't like that world, then he's basically putting himself in an unwinnable situation where, he doesn't believe in anything outside it. And so this is, this like Schopenhauer pessimism that he thinks he has to live with. But I don't think he has to do that. Again, this is putting himself in, he's cutting off his own resources. And, for a sci-fi writer, it actually would have helped his writing and helped his state of mind to adopt Christian ethics. I said some Christian ethics, don't want to keep that vague, just Christian ethics, because that's just something that is very helpful to people. And so it's also something that's a little bit more pragmatic, because with the latter part of his life, it definitely would have helped. And so to stay on topic with the slide, there are different ways to make sense of American decline, which it's going to be helpful, because we often hear about vague explanations. We hear about wokeness, identity politics. It seems like young people even struggle to kind of describe what exactly that is. And so I'd like this, like I said, sci-fi approach to ring a bit more true compared to some of this vague stuff that you hear from commentators and people that repeat from online. So what the two French writers wrote about is viewing capitalism like a machine, kind of similar to one of Howard's villains, like in one of his stories. It's a machine that is engineered to capture things, kind of like colonialism now. That's usually a term used by the left, but I think the right can adopt some of that language just to make sense of this stuff. But in other words, once a group is visible, they have the potential to be vulnerable to capture. Like when a political party exists, they don't have enough leverage to really get any influence on their own. They are clients of the state and not controllers of it. And so, like we said earlier with the Susie Sue slide and Rodney Bingenheimer's, that's how brands are promoted. And maybe Howard could relate to that concept because given his own profession, doing things like horror may not be a successful gig. And it certainly wasn't during his time covering, weird tales, pulp fiction. And doing that kind of writing was deemed, unconventional compared to the other genres, compared to the stuff like the DNG, the French people. Psychoanalysts seems to take much of a priority in academic spheres. The professors seem to gatekeep a lot of the more creative people because that's not seen as like real philosophy, or that's outdated philosophy that we don't really pay attention to. But I think there's a lot of untapped potential, and they're walking away from a winning situation. Now, it's also kind of ironic that Howard's material today is also commodified. It's sold, it's used as a brand, all the things that Deleuze and Guattari warned against. So there's also that irony. Now, in the next slide. Now, today, we see the merging of technology expanding into public and private spaces, insisting that everyone has to adapt to it or else they will be left behind. Now, this is basically a hostage situation where people are being forced to assimilate and eat the cost of it, whether that means surrendering their personal views and going along with their friends, or not having any semblance or self-awareness of a local culture or identity. And so it honestly might even be helpful, this image behind me, it might be helpful to kind of, instead of look at sci-fi, there's that phrase about sci-fi, it's not about science and it's not about fiction. Obviously, like robots and all that stuff has been commodified, and it kind of distorts the original intent, I think. So I would like us to use a lot of these like monster type figures to just make sense of like systems, make sense of certain things that hold younger people back. And then I got some quotes here. I did not cite them, unfortunately, so I just want to preface these are not my ideas. I just want to get the idea out there, but people can look into this themselves. It says here, capitalism and AI are two sides of the same coin, that capitalism is by its nature a complex self-organizing system meant to postpone an entropic annihilation, and that this, as a consequence, creates artificial intelligence into the world as the most effective means to propagate itself. So when we talk about in the past things like neoconservatism, or we see things like, I don't know, some of the turning point type, what would you call them, like parties, certain things like that, it's not so much driven by values, it's not so much driven by this like giant goal. It's more so a machine. It makes more sense as a blob because a lot of that stuff is growing each year, getting more funding each year. And so you start to lose sight of what exactly is the purpose of political parties if they're, especially when they start to fail. If the goal is to make things better, the reason why they continue to exist is not because there's any confusion. They are intentionally just trying to continue it on as a machine. So that is the hostile takeover of human culture and society on the part of tech. It says robots, but again, that's kind of a tired word. And then some more here. Politics of repression among the gatekeepers of the current world order. Quote, the global human security allergy to cyber revolution consolidates itself in the new world order, or a consummate macropod, inheriting all the resources of repression as a concrete collective history. So that's why I emphasize that it's a form of colonization, not in the, the New World era sense, but in this like technological, like trying to go to space in order to have influence and things like that. So hopefully this might be able to debunk some assumptions about technology, modern capitalism as quote unquote neutral, because I think it's better to understand parties, modern capitalism, technology. These are systems that are often programmed by modern activists, not so much, people on the right just tend to not even talk about technology, but a lot of that anti-technology resentment can be applied, I think, not totally wedded to a leftist framing. So getting to the end here. What is the next slide, by the way? Okay, there we go. I don't want to neglect the Gosling posting. So I understand that's a little bit confusing. When we talked about the hippies, we said that, them as young people were very much not aware of their identity. They didn't know their spot on the political spectrum. They don't understand where the ending is. And so that's how they become vulnerable to being co-opted. That's how their stuff gets commodified. And then you have generations later saying, well, when I was in that scene, it meant this, and now it means this. And I guess they're the loudest voice in the room, so I guess that's what it is now. And I would like us to avoid that co-opting, avoid that cosmopolitan culture that usurps local culture. And so I want us to cling to that localism in the Hans Hermann Hoppe sense, because localism is what keeps people sane during bad times. And so instead of thinking about warfare as, people on a battlefield, think about it as a psychological warfare. Just because, there's not guards in the streets ordering people around, that doesn't mean society isn't less dystopian. Those aspects are still there. And maybe not psychological for this presentation's sake, but technological could be applied. And the other thing too that's ironic is there is men on the battlefield. There is like old style violence happening, but because we don't categorize that as like warfare, if it's a warfare, then we assign moral terms to it. But if it's like people dying in the streets in Chicago, people don't categorize that as an epidemic. It's just the way things go in US. So it's just very frustrating. I think the reason why categorization should be emphasized is so we can get out of that feedback loop that's keeping us stuck and keeping these problems happening. So, final quote from this article I did not cite. Not my quote, not my idea, but the illusion of class antagonism is literally obscured by machinery. Existing technology immerses us in the extreme political program proffered by neoliberalism. Through data bias, the politics of tech culture will invisibly shape the social organization that results from the technologies of the future. The further Silicon Valley shifts, the more dangerous that their machines will become. And so if we could go to the next slide real quickly. I just want to encourage the fact that local culture is still possible. A lot of people look at things like the South as a bygone era because there's been so much bureaucracy in those flyover states. I think there is still a Southern culture. I think it exists in very small spaces. Obviously, if you spend time online, you're not going to see it because it's online. But if you just go to those meet people in physical space and kind of deprogram yourself in a sense to kind of have a more social look, not hyper social, because then we kind of get into the opposite problem of going along, getting along, and trying to be everybody's friend. We just want to find people in real space so that we're not doom scrolling on social media and thinking that every negative headline is the end of the world. So it's about keeping that local culture, even if it seems like it's impossible. And then in the final slide here, I just want to emphasize, it is unfortunate that Howard was stuck in the materialist mindset. And a lot of people our age are also stuck there. They're stuck in materialism. They assume that the debate on religion has been settled and that the Enlightenment liberated people from superstition. But obviously, I would discourage that kind of thinking. A lot of that is a psyop. There's a whole history of smart atheists bullying gullible Christians. And I would like that trend to stop happening because it's very easy to get out of that feedback loop. But it's basically been happening since like the 18th century. And so it's fighting an uphill battle. It is difficult, not saying that it's easy, but I think it's something to keep in mind that you don't have to wed yourself to tech, culture, materialism. And if Howard had kept that local culture from his Rhode Island days, if he had stuck with his writers, his weird tales, his Robert E. Howard friends and this and that, could have cut himself off from cosmopolitan culture. And he could have really, yes, the bad times were coming. Of course, in 29, Howard experienced the Wall Street crash. And you're going to need some of those pre-modern views to keep you intact and some of that localism to keep your mind sane and not fall apart after historical things happen within your lifetime. And so it's about surviving modernity and sticking to those close friends and like a tight-knit type community. And those are the things that are going to keep people sane, is localism and not surrendering to technology. So how about that for some optimism on the Halloween season? Thank you. Thank you. So all right. We have some Elizabeth. Is it yeah, Elizabeth Scott. Yeah, we're back. I'm thinking we're back. So I can't doom scroll because it's too low, but that's okay. Yes, Zoomer.
Do you recommend reading The News?
So I think
The cyber.
I think with caution. Again, I wouldn't endorse everything, but I think it's just a matter of trying to make sense of modernity and technology. And so because there's sort of a vacuum on the right, there's a vacuum on the right, serious moment, by the way, serious movement, by the way, it might be helpful to use some leftist leaning sources because they've kind of had the monopoly on talking about tech, talking about modern capitalism and degradation of society. And so people on the right seem to be in this like fantasy world where the free market is helping everything. And so I want us to cut ourselves away from that. And so with that, I guess technically you might have to, look at some of what the leftists are saying. So it's about not reading it and not like adopting all their views, not like adopting a materialist views. And a lot of this psychoanalysis is very it's kind of subversive and kind of usurps a lot of metaphysical beliefs. So yes.
So on localization, do you see it in terms of like in the future? Do you see localization emerging, I should say, or it's making a comeback or something like that? And if so, when do you think that started?
Yes. So I don't know exactly when it started. Now I want to give credit to the millennial broad, Catherine D., who also talks about this very heavily. She talks about the fact that there is going to be a kind of a mass exit of young people kind of stepping away from dating apps. They're going to step outside. A lot of the stuff that they kind of took for granted because they're going to see kind of the shortcomings of it. And so what that means is kind of meeting in more physical space and probably acting honestly a lot more like boomers. And so I can kind of see something like that developing. Don't know exactly when that started. Maybe kind of the millennials, how they distance themselves a little bit, might be kind of the beginning of the skepticism. But of course, a lot of the tech stuff, not being totally on board with it, that goes back a long ways. But I just think, I don't have all the answers, but I think a lot of young people are just going to get a lot of, they're not really going to want to stay online as much as they are because right now it's a bit of a crutch, but I just see them more meeting in physical space. So, and that could be a concert, that could be friend groups, whatever. It's kind of a vague thing, but I just think online doom scrolling is not going to be the future.
Do you think that goes for the chronically online iPad kids who right now are being raised, with screens in front of their faces at nearly all times?
I think it is. I think Generation Alpha is going to be in a tough spot. Maybe if the Zoomers are nice enough, maybe we can help them out before that. I don't know what the Zoomers are going to do for them, but hopefully we can take some advice from millennials who are already banging the drum saying, this is bad, you're going to be unhappy if you keep doing this. And hopefully if the Zoomers inherit that advice, they pass it down. That's the Hegelian synthesis, the relationship between the generations. I think that can happen unless Zoomers let themselves become victims and become another, slave consumerist class like the hippies. That's the thing. We don't want to be the hippies, not just because of the bad folk rock, but because they surrendered. They surrendered to the journalists and the professors and said, we trust you to write our legacy and do it justice. So I just want Zoomers to be self-aware that all these things are happening, and it involves technology, So, well, all right. No, go for it.
How you talked a lot about materialism. How would you say we should fight back against that Darwinian, Freudian materialism?
True. Well, it's not like a giant. It's not about like isolating yourself totally against it, because obviously it's integrated itself so much. But it's just about it's not being so online in the sense that you're not getting all your news from political commentators that you don't know. It's not about using Twitter and other social media apps as a substitute for like relationships and trying to use it as a substitute for having relationships online as if it's comparable to like a real life one. It's just, it sets up people for false expectations. And so I think just people, also a little ironic, kind of having a little bit more materialism in their lifestyle might be a little bit more helpful. Not using like, dating apps and a lot of this, honestly, something as easy as like not using pornography is seen as like this big radical thing. I mean, taking yourself out of that statistic of one of those people that's doing that consistently, it goes a long ways. It's something that helps people out in the long run. So it's just about, it's not always a matter of doing something. It's also like not doing all the stuff that people seem to take as a given. But, and then did somebody else?
I was gonna ask something about Nick Land, but I don't I can't remember what I was gonna ask. Do you have any thoughts on Nick Land? Actually, I think I was gonna ask that first quote that you said. Is that Nick Land talking about the coin of, what is it? The two sides of the same coin?
I think so. That was from I think that was specifically from an article, but I did not cite it, unfortunately. That's somewhere out there. But the problem with Nick Land is, I'm going to say this. It's a bit of an overwhelming presentation after all that I just gave. So I think it's a lot easier to put it into perspective talking about the French right, where he's getting a lot of his sources. And I think young people and their involvement in online space and modern capitalism and tech. So it's just with Nick, he mixes a lot of stuff together and it makes it very confusing. He gets really into like the cyberpunk thing and the acceleration thing. I don't really think that's a substitute for a worldview. It's interesting, but I don't think people should spend too much time reading some of Nick Land's stuff, because I think it can get distracted. And a lot of these Frenchies, they really get at the heart of it in some aspects. So if that's all, I'm gonna have to break character here and go around I'll take a look at the no, it's cool. There might be some oh man.
There's actually a really good thing from Just Jimmy's.
Yo, Just Jimmy's, we're back.
Talks about post-World War II urban planning.
Hey, who's that? Thank you, Tuesday. Oh, where is it?
What do you think
All
about
right.
that?
What?
With,
Yeah, no. All right, we're going to be wrapping up here. Oh, thank you. Where's the question at? That'll be the last thing so that we can, post-World War II, urban planning. Has a lot to do with the decline of localized culture. Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah, the kind of the New Deal era, a lot of the infrastructure. I want to give Just Jimmy's. I can talk to you anytime, so we can get into that, because I want to give your question justice. So thank you. All right, I think. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you. Appreciate it.